Is the calendar circled? Well, if it's not, it should be. If you've been listening to Matt Zemek all off season, this is the one. This is the first possible pitfall. On the road, Oregon State playing good football. We've got 3 weeks in the books. This is week 4, USC at Oregon State. Welcome into Trojans Live right here at the Voice of College Football. Matt Zemek's on the line to take your comments and questions here for the next hour. Matt, how you doing today?
Ready for game week. I'm not ready for this game to be on Pac-12 Network, but I am ready for USC Oregon State. And folks, if you're listening here on the Voice of College Football, you know this. This is the game I've been circling in red ink the whole year because, Utah, that's a big showdown. And, interestingly, the Notre Dame game might not amount to much at this point, given the way Notre Dame looks. But if USC gets past this road test, maybe the Trojans lose in Salt Lake City, but if USC wins this game in Corvallis, which has been historically a graveyard where Trojans' national title dreams have died, saw that in 2006, saw that in 2008. If USC gets by this test, in terms of the non-Utah road games left on the schedule, I'm not seeing anything that's particularly threatening. Playing UCLA, that should be a breeze. Looking at UCLA is not good. UCLA has clearly not fixed its problems on defense. I wasn't high on the Bruins going into this season. I'm even more convinced now that Lincoln Riley against a past his prime Chip Kelly, Lincoln Riley is going to run rings around UCLA. If you can get past this Oregon State test, USC is going to check several boxes. 8-1 in the Pac-12 minimum, so that probably gets the Trojans to the Pac-12 title game. Though there is a new plot twist we can talk about later, Mark. But USC probably gets to 8-1 in the Pac-12, probably makes the Pac-12 championship game, probably has a 10-win season, probably gets to a New Year's Six bowl game. You beat Oregon State. So many of the goals we've set out for this USC team in 2022 are likely to be reached. Not all of them, but most of them, if you can get past this test against the big bad Beavers up in Research Stadium.
Matt Zemek's works on Trojans Wire. Get on over there. Check out Matt's work. You want to get yourself all set and informed about Oregon State and this matchup against USC. All right. You know what we've got in this game besides the obvious of a Pac-12 matchup that could determine championship hopes down the line is a rarity at this early stage in the season where we've got two teams that have a common data point. Of course, Fresno State and USC just played this past weekend. The Trojans with a convincing 45-17 win. The offense churning out yards and points. And, really they jumped out ahead and they stayed ahead and were never challenged for the most part second quarter on. Whereas, of course, Oregon State and Fresno State played a heck of a game, fun game, down to the wire. Jonathan Smith going for a fourth down last play of the game gamble where he could have opted for the field goal to send the game into overtime, and Oregon State pulls it off. They score from the 2 and win that game in dramatic fashion. So there is a common opponent element here. Your thoughts about USC's performance against the Bulldogs on Saturday night?
Yeah, so, if you've been following my work at Trojans Wire, folks, watching here on the Voice of College Football, the score was 45-17, but this was not an easy game. It wasn't. Don't let the smooth taste fool you. USC had to convert 3 fourth downs in the first 21 minutes to get touchdowns on its first 3 drives. This was not the easy breezy Stanford start where USC didn't face a third down until a minute before halftime, when essentially, that was just a throwaway possession. All the Trojans needed to do on that possession right before halftime against Stanford was just get a first down to drain the clock, and they did. So essentially, USC didn't face a significant third down at any point against Stanford. But against Fresno State, 3 fourth downs early, faced a few 3rd and 10s, a few 3rd and longs. Caleb Williams was able to complete the passes or at least get an 8-yard, 9-yard gain to set up 4th and short, and then subsequently convert that 4th down. This was not the cakewalk that we saw against Stanford. And if you listen to the Riley Files, our off-season podcast special, at Trojans Wire, you know that Iowa State and defensive coordinator John Heacock, they had the secret sauce for containing Lincoln Riley's Oklahoma offenses. And what was that? It was get lots of guys back in coverage, put lots of bodies deep. You're not going to beat us over the top with the deep ball. Caleb Williams, you're going to have to be patient. You're going to have to make the right read. You're going to have to check down. You're going to have to hit Travis Dye on the short flat. And what's another thing that we've said all off season, is that as soon as you get some injuries on the offensive line and you go deeper into the depth chart, that's when the talent drop off and the quality drop off really emerges. So Cortland Ford, he dressed, but he didn't play against Fresno State. So Bobby Haskins was the guy at left tackle. He got hurt twice in this game, a little bit in the second quarter, got hurt again a little bit more severely in the fourth quarter. But when he got hurt in the second quarter and he left and Mason Murphy came in for Bobby Haskins at left tackle, what happened? He got smoked. He got toasted. Fresno State's edge rushers were able to beat him in one-on-one matchups. So Caleb Williams got his first taste of backside pressure, and he didn't respond all that well. I mean, not horribly, like he didn't throw picks, but like he didn't make those check downs. He didn't make those quick adjustments in terms of getting rid of the ball quickly, seeing Travis Dye in the short flat. So he didn't respond to that. And like that's not an indictment of Caleb Williams. It's just first few games were easy, right? And then when something happens to disrupt your flow and your rhythm, okay, it's going to be an adjustment. And so we certainly saw that with Caleb Williams. Point is that as soon as USC gets these injuries on the offensive front, then that's when the architecture can crumble. So Bobby Haskins did come back in the third quarter after his injury in the second quarter, but then he left again in the fourth quarter. So because Cortland Ford dressed for last week, it was at least like a slight chance of a possibility that he might have been pressed into service if absolutely needed, but they didn't need him. I would expect him to play against Oregon State, but he's not going to be 100%, and Bobby Haskins is not going to be 100%, assuming that he plays as well. And so that left tackle position, that is the big raging alarm. It's the siren emoji. That is where USC has to really worry about its larger offensive capacity against Oregon State. And so it sets up so many things in terms of how we break down this game, how we look at it. I mean, I was excited about this game throughout the offseason, as you all know, but now the chess match gets really deep. And what we saw from Lincoln Riley in the second half against Fresno State gives Oregon State more things to study on film, and it really gets into how USC tries to attack Oregon State when the Trojans have the ball. You saw Caleb Williams use the read option, and you saw the threat of Caleb Williams as a runner, pulling the ball away from the running back, using the keeper, usually to the right side. That converted a fourth down. It got some other key plays. And, when Trojan fans, this is USC. We love student body right, of course. Run the ball, ram it down their throat, show them who's boss. Well, that's a piece of it. But having Caleb Williams and the threat of his quarterback keeper, that play will need to be used to set up the power running game, because if everyone's going to crash down on the running back, you need the threat of Caleb Williams taking the ball to the outside to keep defenses honest. And the other thing you're obviously going to need is a screen game. We really haven't seen USC use screen passes a whole lot. And Lincoln Riley has that in his toolbox. I saw it plenty of times at Oklahoma, using wide receiver screens, getting them out in the flat. We could also see Travis Dye used not as much as a rusher in this game against Oregon State, but as a receiver coming out of the backfield. We could also see Travis Dye providing pass protection, blitz pickups, helping with the left tackle if that is needed. If it's clear that Cortland Ford and Bobby Haskins are just not holding up physically, then you might see Travis Dye deployed as someone who chips, someone who helps out with pass protection. But maybe, the threat of Travis Dye blocking is going to set him up as kind of a receiver on like a delay screen, a slow developing play where you try and invite the Oregon State pass rush in, and then you dump a ball to Travis Dye or maybe Austin Jones past the defense. Maybe it's, using the screen from the side where the defense is blitzing or where you're expecting that rush, So that's usually going to be on the left side against the left tackle. So like the contours of this chess match are really getting interesting because in week 2, USC was just throwing long balls and having success against Stanford. Caleb Williams, Jordan Addison, Mario Williams made it look very, very easy. Then against Fresno State with a more physical front four, which challenged USC's offensive line a lot more than Stanford did. And also with that Iowa State scheme of having everybody back, shutting off the deep ball, forcing Caleb Williams to be patient and work the short passing game. USC then had to go to the read option and use Caleb Williams as a runner. So we really got to see more layers in terms of Lincoln Riley's thought process, how Caleb Williams adjusts when things aren't going smoothly. Lots of layers to unpack, but those are like some of the components in terms of how USC's offense attacks Oregon State's defense. It's going to be interesting to watch.
It's our weekly USC show with Matt Zemek from Trojans Wire every Tuesday right here at the Voice of College Football, 1 Pacific time. Our resident Oregon State fan, expert Connor Johnson, noting here, speaking of chess match, a couple pieces missing for Oregon State. Luke Musgrave is one of the better tight ends in the Pac-12. He's got 11 receptions and a touchdown this year. Trey Lowe's a third down back with a couple catches out of the backfield, long receptions, 25 yards per reception, and 7 carries out with injuries for Oregon State. Folks, leave your comments and questions in the chat. We'll get them to Matt. I may have a thing or two to say about this one as well. Again, Saturday night, unfortunately, on the Pac-12 network. Fortunately for me, I get it for the first time ever. But Matt, are you in good shape?
Well, I have DirecTV, so I am up a creek without a paddle. Maybe I can. There might be a Fubo account I can use from a friend, but I'm not absolutely counting on that. So we'll just see where that goes. But in terms of what our friend Connor mentioned, with Oregon State's injuries. So yeah, Luke Musgrave, that is a particularly big injury. Trey Lowe as well. But here's the thing about Oregon State's offense, and I wonder what Connor has to say about this. We really haven't seen Oregon State dominate with the ground game this season. When Oregon State made the comeback against Fresno State, it was Chance Nolan throwing the ball down the field, playing pitch and catch. So, the Oregon State passing game, I think exceeded expectations or been, better than a lot of people thought. And the ground game hasn't really made as much of an impact. Now, having running backs hurt, Trey Lowe's out, and another running back is also, I believe, Isaiah Taylor, I think, is either unavailable or not at 100%. So, the Oregon State's options might be limited. But I can't escape the thought, and I wonder what Connor has to say about this coming from an Oregon State perspective. If Jonathan Smith, has been holding his cards close to the vest, right? Because you don't want to show everything, and this is such a huge game for both programs that you're going to see Jonathan Smith spring a lot of new looks on the USC defense, and of course USC's trying to find its footing under Alex Grinch, and we're seeing, we haven't really talked much about the USC defense, but we've seen the Trojans, have a lot of the same patterns that we witnessed in the first 2 weeks. Now, we didn't get 4 takeaways this game, but USC's red zone defense continuing to make plays after giving up a lot of yards, after allowing an opponent to drive downfield. So the risk about having a good red zone defense is that if you're always allowing the opponent to drive into the red zone, well, what about that game when the opponent finally finishes drives in the red zone? So USC is going to have to figure out a way to not have quite as many red zone possessions. That's going to catch up with the Trojans if they keep tempting fate that way. But in terms of Oregon State, I think Jonathan Smith is sitting on things that he's going to spring up against Alex Grinch. And, Alex Grinch, he coached at Washington State. And when he coached at Washington State, Jonathan Smith was Chris Peterson's offensive coordinator at the University of Washington. And, of course, that was the last time the Pac-12 made the college football playoff in 2016. So, Alex Grinch does have some familiarity with Jonathan Smith. One would think he's going deep into the vault, looking at some Washington concepts under Chris Peterson, and also studying 2021 film on the Beavers. This is not just going to show Lincoln Riley's X and O acumen, which, every USC fan trusts and should trust. How does Alex Grinch prepare for this Oregon State offense? Because we know that the USC run fits on defense. I know that Tim Prangley and Rick Anaya on the USC post-game show on Saturdays here at the Voice of College Football, they have pounded that theme. The run fits are terrible, and that's true. They remain bad, and Fresno State was able to run the ball in the second half, even after Jake Haener went out with an injury. And even when, it seemed as though Fresno State was going to throw the ball, no, Fresno State was still able to move the ball on the ground against USC's rush defense. So, I as from a USC perspective, I am worried that Jonathan Smith has some tools in the toolbox. He's going to unearth them for this game, and USC's defense might not be ready for it. I think that Oregon State is going to try to run first and then throw deep on play action off the run to try and get some big shots, because USC's defense, for all its flaws, one good thing it's done this year, hasn't allowed the home run on a deep pass over the top. So I think Oregon State's going to emphasize, instead of throwing to set up the run, no, I think Oregon State's going to try to run, just go right at the weak spot of the USC defense and set up second and short, and then you can do a play fake, go over the top, try to hit your home run ball. So Jonathan Smith, I'm convinced he's trying to align his offense and show some new run concepts that USC hasn't seen before to get into very favorable down and distance situations and then go to the deep ball. It'll be very interesting to see how Jonathan Smith attacks USC's defense, but there's plenty of reason for concern from a Trojan standpoint.
In addition to 2 wins over the Mountain West, Oregon State coming off a 68-point performance against Montana State this past weekend. Our buddy LBC Trojan, Rick, says Lincoln Riley's change in culture has manifested itself on the field in linebacker Eric Gentry, who led the team with 5 tackles against Fresno State. A new standard is being set on the defensive side. I like the progress made on the defense in the first 3 games.
Eric Gentry's been outstanding. He's getting his long arms. He has a long reach. He's getting into passing lanes. He's making deflections. One of them created one of those red zone stops against Fresno State. And he's also, one of USC's best tacklers already. And he's making an impact with the pass rush as well. I mean, you're seeing Eric Gentry not just play well, but he's affecting different aspects of USC's defense. He's making contributions in many different ways. That's really the big story so far with Eric Gentry, and that's going to be needed against Oregon State because Jonathan Smith, deploys his resources, his personnel in ways that you have to have a lot of different responsibilities. You have to make your presence felt in a number of different ways in terms of, run support versus pass coverage. So Eric Gentry, he certainly becomes a central nerve center for this game against Oregon State.
Yeah, so we've got USC coming off that game, and you painted a bit of a different picture than I thought in just watching the game out of the corner of my eye while I was on doing a call-in show and wasn't able to lock in and really watch it. Run game in support of Caleb Williams. You had Austin Jones at over 9 yards per carry. Same with Travis Dye. They both went over 100 yards. So they threw it 37, ran it 38 against Fresno State.
Yeah, I liked what the run game did. And of course, I think that the thing that Lincoln Riley and his staff need to really monitor is, what level of performance are they ready to expect from Cortland Ford and Bobby Haskins, who are going to play but how effective are they going to be? And so rather than starting the game by going to the right side of the offensive line, I think you actually need, if you're USC, not Oregon State, if you're USC, you need to test early how Ford and Haskins are holding up in some way. Maybe that's just, having Caleb Williams drop back and throw and seeing what the pass protection looks like from his backside, or maybe taking a few running plays to the left side of the line. Maybe you give Ford and Haskins a chance to just fire off the ball instead of retreating in pass protection. But I think if you're USC, you have to know what you're getting from the left tackle spot early in this game so that you can adjust your game plan earlier as needed. Let's just put forth as a hypothetical. Let's say Ford and Haskins are not great on the first drive or two of the game. Lincoln Riley needs to have a plan in place. Like he might have his primary game plan installed, but like he needs to have a very definite plan B for, all right, Caleb Williams, if you're going to get backside pressure, if we can't route our plays too much to the left side of the field, going through the left side of the offensive line, what's our counter? And that could be the screen game. It could be a quick hitch game. It could be a power run game going to the right side of the offensive line, that doesn't put as many responsibilities on the left side of the line. But I think if you're USC and you're Lincoln Riley, you have to know what you're going to get. You have to know what you can reasonably expect early in this game. And of course, the flip side of this is from an Oregon State standpoint, and we can have Connor weighing in here too, is what kind of presence does Oregon State have on the edge to go against Haskins and Ford? Fresno State got some real production from its left side defensive end going up against USC's left tackle, especially when Mason Murphy came in, but also, an injured Haskins also was overpowered at times. So if you're Oregon State, does Oregon State have the dynamic edge presence, to make this a real issue, to make this a real conversation? That's obviously the other thing. So maybe Ford and Haskins aren't going to be at full strength, but if Oregon State can't get a significant edge rush presence in that one-on-one matchup, well, then it doesn't matter if Ford and Haskins aren't at full strength. They can still contain their matchup. And if they can contain their matchup, well, then Lincoln Riley has his full playbook. And he can go with his plan A. But if not, like if Oregon State can really make a dent in USC in that matchup, then Lincoln Riley needs to have his plan B. And it's going to be interesting to see if we get to that, what Lincoln Riley's counter is going to be against Oregon State's pass rush.
Yeah, Andrew Chatfield, Joe Golden, two of Oregon State's better defenders, but have not been around early in the season. As Connor knows here, being back will be huge. They need to get into the backfield. Also, from the offensive side, he had mentioned the wide receiver trio because maybe we're underselling Oregon State in the passing game. And as you noted earlier, Matt, not as run heavy this year, 118 runs, 80 pass attempts. So 60-40 is certainly more balanced than what we saw out of Oregon State last year on the offensive side. And our guy Connor had noted some of their better wide receiver play here with, I'll pop up the stats. We've got guys like Trayshawn Harrison, 16 catches, 14 yards per reception. Anthony Gould, there's the issue with Luke Musgrave, so he's out. Tyjon Lindsey's a target as well as those are the main guys. Anthony Gould there with 8 catches, 24 yards per reception as well. Leave your comments and questions, folks, here at the Voice of College Football. It's our USC show. Bring some friends with you next Tuesday, or you can do it right now. Get out on social media. Let people know that we're here live. That's from 1 to 2 Pacific time each and every Tuesday. Matt, you had mentioned earlier in the show regarding a format change to the Pac-12 that I wasn't necessarily aware of unless you hit me with it, and maybe I heard it and didn't take it into account.
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Oh, okay. You were just running through possible scenarios with USC.
Pac-12 championship. Yeah. So like the big story in terms of the Pac-12, stepping away from USC, Oregon State very briefly, is the Washington Huskies. Like the Washington Huskies looked great against Michigan State. And, I followed Michael Penix at Indiana. And, obviously he wasn't that good last year, but also he had a lot of injuries as well in his career at Indiana. So first off, he's healthy. So, I saw your tweet, Mark, over the weekend that when Penix is right, like, wow, that's a really good product. That's a really good player. But the other thing is, when did Indiana do well? When Kalen DeBoer was Michael Penix's offensive coordinator at Indiana. So like that's a marriage that works. So Tom Allen, Tom Allen without Kalen DeBoer at Indiana, not very good. But with Kalen DeBoer, everything came together. So it's excuse me. So it's clear that the DeBoer Penix marriage really works. It brings out the best in each other. So that's a quarterback and a coach who are very much in sync, and they're maximizing their potential together. And DeBoer DeBoer coached at Fresno State. The Washington looked a lot like Jeff Tedford's Cal teams in terms of the physicality, but also the precision in the passing game. There's a strong Tedford-like flavor to Washington. Side note, Tedford was a consultant, lest people forget. He was a consultant to Chris Peterson on the 2016 team, which made the college football playoff. So Washington really stepped on a rake at Montlake with the Jimmy Lake hire. Really seems to have corrected everything with Kalen DeBoer. Now, big note about Washington's schedule. Washington does not play either USC or Utah. That's pretty big. So if USC or Utah stumble, like if the loser of the USC-Utah game stumbles a second time in the conference, finishes 7-2, I can see Washington getting to 8-1 in the Pac-12 with a comparatively softer schedule and being in the Pac-12 title game. No one was talking about Washington as a top-tier threat to make the Pac-12 championship game before the season. I mean, I think there was a possibility that maybe DeBoer would modestly exceed expectations. Well, he might exceed expectations to a much greater degree after seeing what we saw against Michigan State. So Washington is now definitely a factor in the Pac-12 title race. And, Washington State has to play USC. Oregon State is playing USC and Utah in consecutive weeks. Washington has that lane without USC or Utah in its path to the Pac-12 championship game. So that is the new big plot twist in the Pac-12 state of power, the state of play for the 2022 season.
Absolutely, Matt. I watched every play of that game until it was out of reach and it wasn't going to be, a situation where Michigan State could come back. So I watched all the meaningful plays in that game. And yeah, Penix was remarkable. He has elite talent when he can pull it together, when he's healthy. And what really struck me is I don't know that anyone's selling Michigan State as any kind of great team. I think most of us expected them to take a step back from 11-2 top 10 team from last season, but still they were given the respect of an 11th ranked team in the country by the AP and the coaches poll. I still think they're a good team. They should finish 8-4, something in that range. They're still a quality opponent. And in addition to Penix tearing them to shreds, the physicality on both sides of the ball in Washington's favor against a Big Ten, upper tier Big Ten team was remarkable. Peyton Thorne did his best he played he played really well, but man, he got beat up. My goodness. And the running game for Michigan State was non-existent. And it was almost to your point, like Chris Peterson didn't hand this program to Jimmy Lake. It's like the Jimmy Lake era tenure was completely, it's vanished. It's been completely, dissipated into the ether, and it went straight from Peterson to Kalen DeBoer, and this Washington program looks like it's back where it was a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not fully ready to say Washington State's back precisely because we don't know how good a team Michigan State is. But generally, Mark, you've followed the sport for a long time. I've followed the sport for a long time. A lot of our viewers here on the Voice of College Football have followed the sport for a long time. Like, when you see a well-coached team, when you see a coach who gets it, when you see a team that plays with force, that plays with pace, it's well-oiled, it's a machine. Everything's flowing together. Everyone's in the spots where they're supposed to be. Like, you see this with teams such as Kansas State and that they might not be the most athletic. Now, Washington is very much athletic, but other teams, like, they're in the right spots. You can see it; they're well taught, so that comes across with Washington. But also the force, the pace, the athleticism. Like, you see all the pieces of a really good team already there, and it does seem as though Kalen DeBoer is an excellent hire, and he's going to crush it in Seattle and restore that program, which obviously, changes the dynamic in the Pac-12. The other big picture story in the Pac-12 to note, since we're talking about the conference at large, before we get back to USC, Oregon State, is that the Pacific Northwest is kicking butt. Only one loss among the 4 Washington and Oregon schools, and that one loss was to Georgia. So, Oregon hammered BYU, looked great. And now we have Oregon and Washington State coming up in week 4 as well. So, like, it's USC and the Pacific Northwest that, and Utah, beating San Diego State. Like, San Diego State looked terrible. So, like, that recasts how we look at the Arizona San Diego State game, that the Aztecs just aren't very good, which, is surprising since they made the Mountain West title game, won a pile of games last year, I think 11 under Brady Hoke. So I don't know how much we gain from Utah, shutting down a bad San Diego State offense. But for the most part, USC and the Pacific Northwest are the standout stories in the Pac-12 conference. And we're going to see USC play one of the Northwest schools, and then we're going to see 2 of the other Northwest schools, Oregon and Wazoo, play the other. We're going to learn a lot coming up here in week 4 of the Pac-12.
Yeah, I release conference rankings every week. I've put all the numbers together. I've yet to shoot the video and post it, but that'll be out in the morning. And I had made the once we put all the numbers out there, and then certainly put them into context, that I had the Pac-12 ranked as the worst of the Power 5 the first couple of weeks of the season, but it being a very, very close 3-4-5. And now with some wins against the Big Ten, and the numbers still don't look good for the Pac-12, but if you take it into context, Colorado's losing by 1 million points every week. And, there's some outliers that, sure, they're part of the conference. It has to be taken into consideration, and it's part of the number compilation. But to take this performance of this conference into context, a couple wins against Fresno State, BYU coming off a win against Baylor. They turn around and they get waxed by Oregon. The Washington State win over Wisconsin. I still think we can expect Wisconsin to be a top 20 or 25 team in the nation. And then, what we saw Washington do to Michigan State, again, it was not a close game. It was not an 11-point game. The Pac-12, has been pretty darn impressive in recent weeks.
It has been. And, hey, I've been a fierce critic of Bo Nix, so I definitely have to give him props when he plays well. Like, he was completely on point. Like, it wasn't moderately good Bo Nix. It wasn't tolerable Bo Nix. This was excellent Bo Nix. This was an elite game on a big stage in a big moment. Lots of questions coming in about Nix and also offensive coordinator Kenny Dillingham. Well, straight A's to both the coordinator and Bo Nix for the Ducks in terms of responding to the Georgia game and really showing that they had learned their lesson. Now, without taking anything away from Bo Nix, this Washington State game is going to be a really huge test of him and the Ducks. And there's an obvious parallel to draw here. Much as Oregon really seemed to benefit from BYU being physically drained by that overtime war against Baylor, Oregon now has to take that energy from BYU and carry it into the very next week. And this is a point about scheduling. And this is part of why Nick Saban is the best. It's not just that he has the best teams. It's not just that he has the deepest recruiting classes. Nick Saban schedules appropriately. Like, you don't see Nick Saban schedule tough non-conference games or a tough non-con game right before an SEC game in consecutive weeks. He never steps into that trap. So BYU, just to as kind of like a brief tangent here, BYU needed to schedule McNeese State after the Baylor game and then go to Eugene a week later. So that was a big no-no by BYU. So it cracks the door open in terms of how much we assess the Oregon BYU game. And of course, again, Oregon is now having to deal with that 2-week double stack. Big game against BYU, big game against Wazoo. Now, if Bo Nix goes into Pullman and he throws it down and hammers the Cougars, well, I'm going to have to eat a lot of crow about Bo Nix. There's no doubt about it. But it certainly raises the question of how Oregon State carries what it did against BYU into the next week. And let's look at Washington State for a moment, since we're talking about Ducks Cougars. Washington State played Colorado State. Nice, easy game. No challenge at all. Got to play a lot of backups. Like, that's the game you want in between Wisconsin in week 2, Oregon in week 4. So Washington State has the buffer, much as Oregon State had the buffer of Eastern Washington between the Georgia and the BYU games. And now it's Oregon in the role of BYU, coming off the big game, trying to do it the very next week. It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. It's also going to be fascinating to see what Cam Ward has learned from the first 3 weeks of the season. And maybe, playing Colorado State, a much easier game for him. Maybe that gets him into rhythm, but we still haven't seen Cam Ward play well on a big stage. He did not play well at all against Wisconsin. The defense completely carried the workload for Washington State in that win in Camp Randall Stadium. Like, this is a moment of truth for Cam Ward, even more for Bo Nix. Now, it's important for Bo Nix, but it's even more important for Cam Ward in his career at Washington State. Like, here's the spotlight. Here's the big game. It's at home, conference game. If you want to make a run at the Pac-12 title game, here it is on a platter. What are you going to do, Cam Ward? What are you going to do in this moment?
Absolutely. I was intrigued by the Pac-12's performance over the weekend. Absolutely. Matt's podcast comes out every week. And again, what's the release date on that?
It's out every Tuesday. So we're live with our new show talking about the Arizona State coaching search, some of the ins and outs of that, and the whole mess in Tempe with the Sun Devils, and then previewing USC, Oregon State, Oregon, Washington State, and also talking about, the Mountain West and the surprising upset of Air Force. Wyoming beats Air Force, shuts down the Falcons' offense, and Craig Bohl outcoaches Troy Calhoun once again. Last year Air Force won, but the Falcons scored just 24 points. Craig Bohl has the secret sauce in terms of containing Troy Calhoun's offense. That's an interesting Mountain West story that we covered on Get Off My Pylon, in addition to all the Pac-12 news.
Yeah, that game was one of, I believe, 5 double-digit favorites to go down over the weekend, and a lot of people had pegged Air Force as kind of an under-the-radar possible New Year's 6 group of 5 entry, and a surprising score for many on a Friday night, with Wyoming squeaking that one out. So check out Matt's new podcast. Again, this is edition number 4, Get Off My Pylon. I will find the link and drop it in the live chat, so be looking out for that. Again, Get Off My Pylon with Matt and my Big Ten Paradigm.
Yep. You want to check out Mark's Big Ten Paradigm, also part of the College Gridiron Coast to Coast podcast network.
That is going to be uploaded on Wednesday. We've got a gap on our College Gridiron Coast to Coast network for Wednesday, so that's going to be uploaded this week on Wednesday. Also want to catch this one, Matt. As you mentioned to me before we started, Gary Bryant was a top 50 receiver in the country coming out of high school, number 7 rated according to 247 Sports, top 5 player in the state of California. And it's not like he just, was some big 5-star bust. No, he caught 44 passes, almost 600 yards, was a main cog in the USC passing attack last year with 7 touchdown receptions, but he has decided to redshirt.
Yeah, I mean, Gary Bryant could see the math. He could see how you have Jordan Addison, you have Mario Williams, you have Brendan Rice, you have Terrell Bynum, you have Taj Washington, all getting more catches than he is. And so, Bryant is terrifically talented, but this is a numbers game, and just how much playing time, how much of a role can he have on this team? I'm not going to sit here and say I expected this, but you look at the first 3 games and, Gary Bryant did the math. And so, it'll be interesting to see if he transfers out of the program. He's making this decision to redshirt. Maybe that decision will hold, but it'll be interesting to see if Gary Bryant reconsiders his career and where it goes from here. But, it's entirely understandable looking at USC these first 3 games. And, maybe a part of this for Gary Bryant and his calculus is like, whoa, Jordan Addison, whoa, Mario Williams, their talent levels and their ceilings as players are so high. And Bryant might have thought to himself, whoa, I'm not nearly at that standard. I'm not nearly at that place in my evolution as a receiver. I need to cede these snaps to others for the good of the team. And I need to, find my chance next year, whether that is at USC or somewhere else. It's pretty understandable that Bryant didn't want to give up a year, being a bit player on the periphery of the USC offense in the wide receiver room. It makes sense.
Okay, Uncle Rico making some comments. Basically, what happened here was I have decided to do a live call-in show every Tuesday night at 8:30 Eastern time, as folks, of course, still don't get many. Many do, and I credit those of you who back me up on this, the top 25 that actually makes sense. So I have challenged everyone who has issues with this, that just say you're dumb, you're a moron, it doesn't make sense, but then don't substantiate it with discussion and reasonable points. Please call the call-in show. We'll be live at 8:30 Eastern time on the main channel tonight and every Tuesday night.
Like, these are fluid things, folks. Like, Arkansas through 2 weeks was a top 10 team. Arkansas after 3 weeks and getting a battle from Missouri State is not a top 10 team. Like, things change. Like, these are not things that are set in stone. You have to go out and re-earn your status every week. That is how it should be. Like, just because you have a 1 in parentheses next to your name in 1 week's rankings or 1 week's poll, that doesn't mean you're entitled to it for the rest of the season, right? Like, that, this should be obvious. So you definitely want to get over to Mark Rogers' top 25 that makes sense, and that call-in show should be very interesting tonight.
I made the point. I tried every way to come up with some type of analogy for this, Matt. I came up with many. This would be one. I said, let's say Matt and I are both salesmen selling whatever the product is. And let's say in week 1, I sold $500 worth of a product and Matt sold $100. And each week our supervisor ranked us. Well, obviously I would be ranked ahead of Matt after week 1's performance. But let's say in week 2, after Matt sold $500 in week 1, he sold $1,000. He did even better in week 2. So he's automatically ranked ahead of me, right? No, what if I went out and sold $10,000 in week 2? Well, yes. Just because your name's Syracuse doesn't mean, you're sent to the abyss of college football forever until you're like 10-2 or something. And then suddenly we'll say, okay, you must be pretty good. I am not here to sell Syracuse as the 3rd best team in the country. No, but the resume right now is really good. Right now. Do I expect it? Anyway, it's quite interesting. Yes. All right. Let's see where we stand on anything else.
Yeah, just the other point to make here, Mark. Let's remember that the 2014 season poisoned the well for so many college football fans with the college football playoff and how we rank and how we evaluate teams. And what was the really big scandal of the 2014 playoff in those rankings? It was that TCU was number 3 in the penultimate, the next to last ranking show. It beats Iowa State by 52 points. Did exactly what it was supposed to do. But then Ohio State vaults them. I know Ohio State looked great against Wisconsin, but TCU did not stumble in that last game. And yet TCU was number 3. So it created the idea that the label on the soup can, if you would reverse those positions, if Ohio State was number 3 and TCU was number 5, I would bet every last dollar I own, which isn't a whole lot, that Ohio State would have remained ahead of TCU. But because it was TCU and because it was Ohio State, the brand name program got elevated. It's much as Alabama made the 2017 playoff because it was the biggest brand name. It was the biggest TV draw, and it just it reinforces that idea for college football fans that your brand name is what matters in the rankings, and that if you have the leverage and you're a brand name, you get the benefit of the doubt in the rankings. That is never how it's supposed to go. It's what have you done? What's the work you do? What's the product you create each and every week? What is your collection of results each week as we reevaluate freshly each week your body of work? That's how it's supposed to work. But the college football playoff, the BCS, and AP polls and coaches polls throughout the past several decades, they have all reinforced the idea that if you're an elite school with the elite brand name, that premium brand name on the soup can, then you get the benefit of the doubt in every situation. And fans are programmed to think like that. And what Mark Rogers is doing with his top 25 that makes sense, we strip away the label on the soup can. It's just soup. What's the best soup? Forget about Campbell's. Forget about Progresso. Whatever brand you might like. That's irrelevant. It's what's the best soup. What soup has the heartiest ingredients? You strip away the label. You're just looking at the metal can. What's the best quality? That's kind of the philosophy of this. Ignore the labels. Just look at the product.
And again, the title is that it makes sense, not that it's perfect, not that it's flawless. Certainly call in and we'll discuss. I'm not saying that, and I've had a number of people comment in the comments and then they come up with their own top 25 that makes sense. And I've looked at it and said, yeah, I totally get just because I've got somebody at 10 doesn't mean they can't be 12 or 14 or, it's just a measured, logical look at the results driving the rankings, not perception, or we think Ohio State's 13 this week, for example. I do not think Ohio State's the 13th best team in the country. I think they're much better than that, but they have yet to prove it. Absolutely.
Like, who is the best team in the country, or who's the fifth best team in the country? Like, we can make our projections there. Like, Mark, you mentioned Syracuse. Syracuse has a great resume. No one thinks that Syracuse is one of the top 10 teams in the country.
No.
But does it have the third best or however best body of work through 3 games? Like, you can make a case, given that it has quality, multiple Power 5 wins already on its resume, whereas loads of other schools don't. And of course, with Notre Dame looking absolutely terrible, dealing with Ohio State's ranking for a moment, like Ohio State's win over Notre Dame, that doesn't count for much, or at least it shouldn't, right? Notre Dame lost to Marshall, was lucky to beat Cal, phantom offsides call against Cal in the first half, and then a Hail Mary at the very end, which went off the fingers of multiple Cal receivers.
Yeah.
So beating Notre Dame right now, like, none of us expected this, but it's what we have. A win over Notre Dame right now, 4th week of September, 2022, doesn't mean much. Again, it's surprising. It's not what any of us thought, but if that's like the empirical, observable reality we have in front of us. So if you're saying, they beat Notre Dame when Notre Dame was ranked number 5, no, it's not what you're ranked when you beat someone. It's the quality of team over the course of the season. And we're constantly reevaluating the quality of wins over a season. So the value of a Notre Dame win in week 1 was really high because we all thought Notre Dame would be great. But the quality of a Notre Dame win now has to be much lower. So accordingly, you have to rank Ohio State much lower. And we briefly touched on this earlier in terms of our discussion of the Pac-12. So we got to follow Michigan State and BYU. Like, we now need to see how good Michigan State and BYU are in terms of how we measure Oregon and Washington and the quality of their rankings. In terms of where we rank Oregon and Washington over the rest of the season, how well BYU and Michigan State fare, that is a central question in terms of how we constantly reevaluate a top 25 ranking, which makes sense here at the Voice of College Football.
Yeah, all sorts of people are piling on Notre Dame right now, and for good reason. They've looked awful the last couple of weeks. But if we're sitting here in 3 months and they've beaten Clemson and USC, well, then they righted the ship, and it's different.
Then that becomes a higher quality win. Absolutely. That's how it goes. That's how it's supposed to go.
Look at what Florida's done since the Utah game. They've struggled.
Exactly.
Connor Johnson brings up that Oregon State is 15th on FPI efficiencies with an 8th ranked offense, 49th ranked defense. USC is number 4, second ranked offense, 43rd ranked defense. It's in Corvallis, though. Yeah, it looks based on the metrics, and that's a very small sample size, but still looks like a comparable matchup for sure. I haven't seen the line, Matt. Do you know what the line on the game is?
Yeah, it's USC by 6.5. And I think that's a lot of respect shown to USC based on, the Trojans have not been significantly tested in their first 3 games. And, obviously one pressure point for Trojan fans watching this game is, what happens when you get late into the fourth quarter? Like the USC has not experienced that really intense game pressure. I use a college basketball example every time I talk about the concept of game pressure. UNLV 1991, going for the back-to-back national championships, unbeaten season, heading to the Final Four. UNLV cruised through that 91 college basketball season. But when it got to that nitty-gritty final seconds, really tight game against Duke, you could see every UNLV player, get more nervous, didn't flow freely, bad shot selection. Like that is always my go-to example of when a team doesn't face game pressure for several games, lots of time, and then it gets into that really intense situation, what happens? So, like this game is so important for USC that I hope USC doesn't have to worry about sweating out the fourth quarter. But I think it will. And just in terms of a prediction, I think it's going to be a tight game in the fourth quarter. And if we get to that scenario, okay, what are you going to do, Caleb Williams? How are you going to respond to this moment? And if he has the ball with one drive to win or lose the game in the final 2 minutes, that would certainly be a Heisman Trophy style scenario setting up for Caleb Williams. And I think there's a very decent chance we get that scenario in this game, just because USC's defense is like the guy who hits on 18 at the blackjack table and gets blackjack. Like, I don't think there are many USC fans who thought that through 3 weeks we wouldn't have allowed 30 points in one game yet, and we held opponents under 20 points twice. Like Rice, okay, but Fresno State to 17, and of course part of the luck there was Jake Hayner getting injured early in the third quarter. Nevertheless, you wonder if the odds, and the roll of the dice or the spin of the roulette wheel is going to go against USC's defense this time. If so, does Caleb Williams have it in him to rise to the challenge, make plays in a very tight late fourth quarter situation? Obviously, one of the things we have to wonder about heading into Corvallis.
Folks, the coaches poll, Michigan State's 21, Washington's 24. How in any rational thought universe is that logical? It's because Michigan State was 11 or whatever they were before that game. So you can only drop them so far. It's a rule. You can't drop them too far.
And why was Michigan State 11th? Because it won a New Year's Six Bowl the year before. So that's another layer of baked-in bias. That if you do something well one year, you get the benefit of the doubt coming in the next year. As soon as games are played in the new season, like in terms of a preseason poll, and we shouldn't have them, but if you're going to have them, fine, I get it. It's based on the preseason. But once the games start, what happened the previous year shouldn't matter at all.
And you're right, Trevor. All rankings are subjective unless you've got a computer to do it. Mine are as well. I would never in any way say that there's some kind of bias within me, but I do my very best to clear the deck and at least approach it in an unbiased, logical manner. All right, Matt, any parting shots on USC and Oregon State? This should be a heck of a game. I believe it's 9:30 Eastern, Pac-12 Network.
Yeah, so I think if you're making a checklist in terms of keys to this game, and I'm not speaking from a USC perspective or an Oregon State perspective, just overall, like the biggest keys to this game. 1, USC's left tackle situation, how well that particular position performs for USC. That's going to dictate the rest of the game. 2, Oregon State's ground game. How much can the Beavers establish, especially between the tackles, but just more generally, how much can Oregon State expose USC's weak run defense and then set up plays over the top after softening up USC's defensive front. Because like if Oregon State's going to need some vertical quick strikes in this game, playing with the ground game and complementary football. If Oregon State doesn't get the deep shot in addition to pounding the ball at USC, that's not going to be the complete offensive profile Oregon State needs to win the game. Third, Caleb Williams on the road. This is going to be a daunting environment, or at least it figures to be. Corvallis, USC's historical graveyard. Is Caleb Williams, after getting a little taste of adversity last week, not handling the pass rush all that well, especially from his backside, is he ready to make adjustments and play his very best? USC is going to need Caleb Williams at his very best. He wasn't at his very best against Fresno State, but if USC gets the very best of Caleb Williams, it should win. But if he's not at his best and USC doesn't maximize possessions, then this game can slip away from USC. So those are like the three, I think, the feature headline keys to this game. USC left tackle, Oregon State ground game, Caleb Williams, how does he handle the moment? Those are the three ultimate keys to this game.
We've got USC postgame live here at the Voice of College Football following Oregon State. Our next show is Iowa Live right now on the Iowa channel. I'm going to get on over there right now. And again, join Matt and myself back here next Tuesday. Matt, we appreciate it. Enjoy the game.
It's a big one. Thanks.